Greetings to all the learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is the review of the work by Hans J. Morgenthau, name of the book Politics Among Nations. In this lecture, we shall try to analyze the key ideas, academic context, evolving debate of this one of the most extensively referred textbook in international relations literature. In this lecture, while the analysis of politics amongst nations, the work by Hans Morgenthau, we shall try to understand role of power in international politics. We should also try to analyze main ideas of the classical realist, the political realism as an approach in international politics. In this lecture, as we analyze and review Hans J. Morgenthau's work, Politics Amongst Nations, we shall also look at the aspects of textual and contextual reading, look at the main features of realism, importance of power in international relations, looking at the big picture of national interest and situating this work within the context of Cold War and the important aspects it presents. Hans J. Morgenthau's work, Politics Amongst Nations, The Struggle for Power and Peace, indeed a very significant literature and text with reference to international relations perspectives. Hans Morgenthau was known for his important contributions to international relations theory. He also made important contributions when we look at the United States foreign policy. The German-born American political scientist and historian, while this work of Politics Amongst Nations presented a very significant perspective with reference to understanding international relations. He was a contributor to numerous scholarly periodicals, journals of opinion. Morgenthau was also the author of some other important works, namely Scientific Man versus Power Politics, next, In Defense of National Interests, next, Hans Morgenthau's work, that is Dilemmas of Politics, another important work, The Purpose of American Politics, another important work, Politics in the 20th Century, and Truth and Power. Now, as we begin our review of Morgenthau's work, Politics Among Nations, we shall first try to understand the debate between the contextual and textual analysis. Dear learners, when we talk about textual and contextual analysis, these terms are usually used while doing an in-depth analysis of various work. The textual analysis asks us to look at the text as it is and what literary strategies it entails. The contextual analysis focuses on better understanding the reasons behind why a particular work is written, that is, as a part of a bigger framework. As we understand Hans Morgenthau's work, we need to understand the phase of Cold War. Cold War was a state of conflict between nations that did not involve direct military action, but it was pursued primarily through economic and political actions and propaganda. Now, dear learners, this term is most commonly used to refer to the American-Soviet Cold War, the time framework 1947 to 1991. As we try to understand international relations with reference to Hans Morgenthau's perspectives coming from Politics Amongst Nations, it is also very pertinent to keep into account idealism as a framework, as a paradigm in international relations. An example of idealism, to elaborate further on it, we take reference to 14 points that was there on January 8, 1918. It was a declaration by the then United States President Woodrow Wilson during the World War, outlining his proposals for a post-war peaceful settlement. It talked about, and we quote from 14 points, from some of the important aspects: open covenants of peace openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understanding of any kind of, but diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in the public view. Another important point from 14 points presented by US President Woodrow Wilson is that a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Now, as we look at this, important ideas presented in the first point and the last 14 point that we read, the focus here is that there are possibilities for peace, world governance, factoring in cooperation. However, dear learners, what happens here is that after the First World War, the world witnesses the Second World War. And we all know that right after the Second World War, there was the ideological war through various political and economic means with the Cold War. Now, with the Cold War, with the power supremacy going between United States and the then USSR, we have to understand that how the intellectual foundations provided by Hans J. Morgenthau were useful. Because once again, we take reference to this very important review of Hans Morgenthau's work from New York Times, and the important ideas here are that the position of leadership for which US was somewhere, when we look at the Cold War start, was intellectually unprepared, and the approach that later became the guiding principle of foreign policy for over next 4 decades, as devised by George F. Kennan, known as containment, the intellectual foundation of it was provided by Hans J. Morgenthau. Now, when we look at politics amongst nations, dear learners, we present you some very interesting facts, that the first of 5 editions published during Morgenthau's lifetime went through 8 printings, and the second through 6. It influenced Walter Lippmann, Reinhold Niebuhr, Raymond Aron, amongst others. So, what we see, once again, quoting for this very important idea that we read from New York Times with reference to the ideas presented by Barry Gould, that is, Morgenthau's book revolutionized thinking, that its author has been called as the founding father of the entire modern study of international affairs. Some have also compared his status to that of Freud in psychology. Now, let's now look at some of the important aspects that we get from Hans Morgenthau's work. Now, as we analyze, one has to, when we go through the reams of the various pages and the various ideas of politics amongst nations, Hans Morgenthau looked at human nature in a fairly constant manner. With reference to review of history, the focus was towards being empirical as well as logical. People in all places and that at all times strive for power. That is one of the important ideas in the book. And this was also the essential idea behind Morgenthau's thinking. To quote from the work, human nature, he insisted, has not changed, and the job of the statesman was to preserve his country's security in the face of this unending struggle. Now, looking at this aspect of human nature, Morgenthau urges policymakers, people having stake with reference to international relations and international politics, that is, one has to look at the world as it was. Now, this brings to us important features of realism. That is, it looks at human nature in the sense of selfish and egoistic aspects. The ultimate goal that realism identifies is that of self-interest. It places greed of human nature at the center of international relations. That's why when we look at how the work says, international politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power. Similarly, this work also points out that one can sense the ideas of the traditionalists. That is, one must understand the context. Behavioralism in international relations, that time attempts to make IR as science. When we look at the debates and the academic issues prevailing that time. Now, herein one must state the other important work of Hans Morgenthau in order to do justice to our analysis of Hans Morgenthau's work of politics amongst nations. Here, dear learners, when we see that how he tries to revisit the traditional aspect of studying politics with a focus on power. In this work, Scientific Man versus Power Politics, which was there in 1946 by the realist academic Hans Morgenthau, in this work, there was this very important assertion that emphasis on science and reason as routes to peace meant that states were losing interface with historic traditions of statecraft. And again, there are examples in the book that how this was shown to be deficient when we look at the example of Nazism in Germany. Another aspect that we get while analyzing Hans Morgenthau's work is that this work makes an attempt to account for principles that holds nations, that nations always define and act as for securing their national interest. Now, herein the focus is on power. The assumption that political leaders think and act in terms of what is called as interest defined as power. Now, the work also says that interest defined as power is a universally valid category. An essential element of politics, that is, and when we try to dwell deeper into the analysis, that is how the work by Hans Morgenthau presents a clear picture with reference to foreign policy makers regarding the aspect that while we are talking about politics, it is power which is the central fact. The work says, and we quote, "The concept provides the link between reason trying to understand international politics and the facts to be understood. It sets politics," and we quote, "as an autonomous sphere of action and understanding apart from other spheres." Further, when we try to analyze that how with the focus on concept of interest defined in terms of power, Morgenthau's work in the very first pages tries to list some of the advantages. What are they? And we read from the work. Imposes intellectual discipline upon the observer. Next, infuses rational order into the subject matter of politics. Next, makes the theoretical understanding of politics possible. Now, when we talk about universal moral principles, now herein the work clearly says that universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in their abstract universal formulation, but they must be filtered through the concrete circumstances of time and place. Further, the work also says these principles must be accompanied by prudence, Quoting from the work, there can be no political morality without prudence, that is, without consideration of the political consequences of seemingly moral action. Further, while we try to understand and analyze Hans Morgenthau's work, in this work one gets a sense of analysis of distinction between realism and other schools of thought. Namely, that is, when we look at how the work points out that the realist theory of international politics then will guard against two popular fallacies. Now, what are these fallacies as the work points out? First, concern with motives. And why are motives stated? Because, as the work says, and we quote, history shows no exact and necessary correlation between the quality of motives and quality of foreign policy. Another related aspect, that is, good motives give assurance against deliberatively bad policies. They do not guarantee the moral goodness and political success of the policies they inspire. Further, the work also presents an analysis of distinction between realism and schools of thought, as we are discussing, that it points out that concern with ideological preferences, one has to guard against this fallacy. Why? Because, as the work says, political reality is replete with contingencies and systemic irrationalities. Another important analysis that we get while going through this work, that is, it makes an important distinction between influence and actual guiding forces for IR. As the work says, and we quote, personality of the statesman, ideas do have some impact on the nature of foreign policy. Yet, in the main, the foreign policy of a nation is always based upon considerations of national interest conceived in terms of national power. The key concept of interest, defined as power, is an objective category which is universally valid. Quoting from the work, Thucydide statesman, born of experiences of ancient Greece, that identity of interest is the surest of bonds, whether between states or individuals. The work also presents Max Weber's observation, and we quote, that is, interests, material and ideal and not ideas, dominate the actions of men. So, power covers all social relations which serve that end, from physical violence to the most subtle psychological ties by which one mind controls the other. The understanding of power in Hans Morgenthau's work is that domination of one person by the other. And this is valid with respect to power in all ways. The sole justification of power, as the work points out, aggrandizement. That is, whether it is whether the power it is disciplined by moral ends and controlled by constitutional safeguards, or it is an untamed and barbaric force. In both cases, politics is about power, and power is about aggrandizement. Further, the work says political realism is aware of the moral significance of political action. It is also aware of the ineluctable tension between the moral command and the requirements of successful political action. The work further says, and we quote, and it is unwilling to gloss over and obliterate the tension, and thus to obfuscate both the moral and the political issue by making it appear as though the stark facts of politics were morally more satisfying than actually are, and the moral law less exacting than it actually is. The work further says, and we quote, realism maintains that universal moral principles cannot be applied to actions of states in their abstract universal formulation, but that they must be filtered through concrete circumstances of time and place. Political realism refuses to identify the moral aspirations of a particular nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. Exactly the concept of interest defined in terms of power that saves us from both that moral excesses and that political folly. And why it is justified? We are able to judge other nations as we judge our own land, and having judged them in this fashion, we are then capable of pursuing policies that respect the interest of other nations while protecting and promoting those of our own. Moderation in policy cannot fail to reflect moderation of moral judgment. The work says, and we quote, "Difference then between political realism and other schools of thought is real and it is profound. Political realism maintains the autonomy of the political sphere. Political realist is not unaware of the existence and relevance of standards of thought other than political ones. As political realist, he cannot but subordinate these other standards to those of politics." So, it heightened the unique nature and also highlighted the unique nature of international relations theory. That is, quoting from the work, "Theory which tries to understand international politics as it actually is and as it ought to be in view of its intrinsic nature rather than as people would like to see it. It must overcome a psychological resistance that most other branches of learning need not face. A book devoted to the theoretical understanding of international politics therefore requires special explanation and justification." So, dear learners, let's sum up. The first principle the work presents to us, that is, politics is governed by objective laws having roots in human nature. The second principle, national interest defined in terms of national power. Third principle, interest is always dynamic. Fourth principle, abstract moral principles cannot be applied to politics. Fifth principle, difference between moral aspirations of a nation and the universal moral principles. And sixth principle, autonomy of international politics. Skillful diplomacy on these principles, the outcome that they lead to, that is stability via balance of power. The work also points an interesting idea that balance of power and policies aiming its preservation are not only inevitable but an essential stabilizing factor in a society of sovereign nation. So, here it was an analysis of Hans Morgenthau's work of politics amongst nations. Hans Morgenthau is also called as founding fathers of the realist perspective in international relations. The realist school of thought in 20th century, with the main ideas, that is, it's a nation states, the main actors in international relations, main concern of the field of IR, that is study of power, the perspective view that of international relation focusing on the competitive and the conflictual side, all of it gets a very important input by the work Politics Amongst Nations of Hans Morgenthau. There is an evolving debate that nature of international relations has changed a lot since Cold War. An example to that is how feminism points towards a male bias in international relations concepts and realist theories. But still, the work by Hans Morgenthau, Politics Amongst Nations, is important because it tells us that international relations, we have to look at it the way in which the world nations interact, issues of conflict or that of peace. The subject, therefore, is important in all ages. Dear learners, we hope the discussion on Hans J. Morgenthau's work, Politics Among Nations, the Struggle for Power and Peace, presented to you significant inputs and insights. We look forward to positive and encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.